So we reached out to you, not sure what we were going to talk about. We thought we might revisit the Reformation, but you came back to me and said, no, I've got something else I want to talk to you about, which means we might not talk about Bitcoin too much today. Maybe we'll see if it comes up. But it's something when you raised it, both me and Danny were like, let's definitely talk about that. We think it's super interesting. There are, when we get into it, people understand, but it has a meaning to me in terms of producing content and understanding the influence people have on other people. So, but I come with no questions because I think this is just a conversation for us to have. So do you want to give me the background of what it is you want to talk about?
Yeah, sure. And it's kind of interesting how this like number 7 keeps coming back. So it's, and I know we're like leading up and like, oh, what is it? But like, it's basically been 7 years that I'm not involved with that anymore. And so I remember there was this, when you go to therapy, like the idea is that the therapist, it's a bit of an unequal relationship. Like they're kind of in a power, dynamic. So if you ever want to be like regular friends with a therapist, genuinely they recommend to like wait 7 years. And then like, then things are, and so interestingly, like it's been 7 years for me. And like now I feel kind of ready to talk about it. And I think it's relevant to, we'll get into it, I'm sure, to some of what's going on the internet and even with crypto. But so, yeah, the short of it is that I was involved in an online cult. I think it's fair to call it that way. We can maybe go into, what makes up a cult or things like that. And the time frame was approximately 2008-9. Yeah, let's say 2009 through to 2014, like early 2015 maybe. So yeah, that's about 6 years. And it's not like I lived in a commune and things like that. But it was really involved, and like a lot of my friends were involved with that too. And yeah, it was very, very, very toxic and confusing. And it took me a long time to like figure out what was going on and leave,
Well, I think I think a lot of people listening right now could be thinking, well, what is this? You joined a cult in 2008, 2009, left in 2004. Is this Bitcoin?
Yeah. I mean, the time frame. No, it was totally not. No, it was. I guess it's hard to say. I guess you could say the cult was named, or the community was named, or the project was named Free Domain Radio. I think a lot of the early Bitcoiners will be familiar. The guy who ran it is Stefan Molyneux. He started it in 2005, and it's real interesting because I forget when he's born exactly, but I remember calculating that he was about 36 years old when he started it, which is kind of like the same age that I have now. And so it's really interesting to look back from that angle too. And so, on the face of it, what he was doing was producing podcasts and doing like call-in shows and talking to a lot of young people. And the angle was like philosophy, like we're going to be, philosophically analyzing what's going on with the world, thinking from first principles, like rational debate, that kind of thing. And then ideologically, his bent was very much first kind of like Republican libertarian, and then into like kind of anarcho-capitalist. And then interestingly later, he made a switch to like kind of like born again Christian type audiences, and also Trump. Like in 2016, he was like a Trumper, even before Trump got elected. So yeah, I mean that was what it looked like on the surface, and I learned about it because a friend of mine, like he was like, oh look, here's this piece that Molyneux had written about that was critical of academia, and it was kind of this. Now it's a more familiar story about like, well, the government obviously funds lots of universities, and so you get certain ideologies that permeate the university, especially in Europe and Canada, maybe like a little bit less in the US because there's more like free market forces at work. And so he was kind of critical of the academic world, and it really spoke to me. And so I was like, oh, like digging into like, oh, what else is this guy about? And then discovering that he was like, I mean, I don't know. I think he's at like 5,000 podcasts now. Like he was like producing huge amounts of content. And a lot of it was just kind of him, like, you know, monologues, like long monologues, like 3 hours sometimes. And so I noticed that he was talking a lot about family stuff. And to me, it was like, whoa, like not only, you know, does he understand economics in a way that I think probably makes sense, but like there's this whole like, you know, self-improvement, like working with trauma, and his wife was a therapist.
We discussed that in our first ever interview.
Yeah, we actually did talk about family stuff, right? Yeah. And yeah, I mean, we talked about how I broke from my family. Yeah, and so it was like, and so I started listening to this podcast just like day in, day out. And it took a long time before I've met the first people that were also listeners. But that's how it started.
Well, I'm aware of him. Danny, can you look up, I'm trying to remember, it's either a podcast or a documentary. I think, can you look up Rabbit Hole, the New York Times Rabbit Hole?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Have you listened to that? Was that the one with Stefan Molyneux? There was a guy, they talked about going down the internet rabbit hole and where you can end up. And I'm sure they were talking about a guy went on YouTube and he ended up finding a Stefan Molyneux video. And then he started going down the Stefan Molyneux rabbit hole. And it sounded very toxic when he explained it. I think also Stefan Molyneux's been on Rogan, and that's one of the shows that's been removed.
Yeah, he did. I think he did 2 appearances.
I think they've been.
It was him in that podcast.
I thought so. I mean, so that's that's the only awareness I have of him from Rabbit Hole. But the explanation of what he was doing and the way he was manipulating his audience was pretty clear in that.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but yeah, I would say his peak was around, in terms of popularity, it was around 2014, 15, and then 16 too, but in a different way because it was more about Trump. But in the libertarian circles, like 2014, 15, anyone who was browsing online, because he was doing so many interviews as well, so he would like interview scientists and all kinds of people, and he's incredibly well spoken, so it's tempting to just go on the show and he asks you about your work, and of course in the process he legitimizes his own projects.
So you talk about it being a cult, but you start out just listening to his content, and then talk to me about starting to meet some people, what that meant, and how you've kind of found yourself in that cult.
Yeah, like I think and again, I think cults are probably like a spectrum. I'm definitely, I didn't even I've never even read a book about cults, so I'm sure people will have all kinds of things to say about how I classify things, and I do think it's probably like a spectrum. I think when people are somehow emotionally immature, or they just tend to see the world black and white, which I think is how he sees things, and like good and evil, and us versus them, me against the world, that kind of thing. I think those kind of people tend to be susceptible to either joining a cult, or in his case creating it. So what it looked like, well, to me, one of the main things that made it more cultish is the moral angle, where it's like, maybe your parents are evil, maybe, and all kinds of like reasonings to justify that, like, oh, they could have found better resources and done a better job, and they didn't, and like, so they knowingly did this and that, and his audience was like 20-year-old kids, like, if like now being that kind of age, like in my mid 30s, yeah, if I see someone who's 20 years old, like they basically just came out of high school, they're very impressionable, and if I pontificate about things, and especially I could ramble for an hour and kind of pull up all kinds of theories that I might have heard, and then what if I don't credit my sources, and then it's like I'm a genius because I came up with all these mind-blowing ideas in the eyes of a 20-year-old. So that's kind of how he made himself the authority. And another aspect, I think, is aside from the moralistic stuff, is and again, I don't think he's evil, right? I mean, I think he genuinely believes that stuff. but is being manipulative, right? Is really having a lot of double standards and like, for example, one of the things he would do is, on the one hand, he would be like seemingly so like humble. It's like, oh, what do I know? I'm just a guy on the internet. Like, but he would do these. Sorry, this is in the context of like 2-3 hour long call-in shows where, like, if you have an issue with your girlfriend or whatever, you would call in and he'd be like your instant therapist, and he would, like, of course, immediately know what's going on, and like kind of like Tony Robbins style almost, where it's like, yeah, like I have this magic sense that I immediately know what's going on. But so on the one hand, he would be like, well, yeah, I mean, you don't have to do anything. I'm not telling you what to do. Like, what do I know? I'm just some guy on the internet. But then in other times, he would just be like, well, I don't know. I've only done this 20 years, right? I've only been a professional full-time philosopher for, so all this weird stuff. And then it took a long time to figure out, like, oh, but like, or like, for example, he would tell people what to do, and then it took, eventually you learn about his biographical timeline. It's like, well, he didn't do that, right? He's telling people to do all this work or to, pursue philosophy as much as you can. Whereas, like, he first made sure he was comfortable financially before he started doing all this stuff. And now it's still his business. Like, he's asking people money, and, so, those are some of the things that I think that stand out. And then the culture that he really, cultivated, the culture that was, what that show was about and what he was about, was also in that manipulative sphere where it's like a lot of psychologizing. Like, anything you say, I'm gonna like interpret like, well, maybe tell me about your I mean, this sounds such a trope, but like, tell me about your childhood, and like, oh, like, where does that come from, and like, la 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 la. And so basically, it's a way to never take responsibility for him. Like, he can always like hold a mirror in front of someone and be like, well, maybe you're being critical of me because of this stuff that you haven't worked out. Like, I'm enlightened, but like, you gotta. And of course, I'm like kind of like going through the elements, and I think another large element is like isolation. Is that like, it's this us against them. Like, they're the muggles, like they're the people who are like, stupid and they don't study philosophy, and we're like the small circle of like enlightened libertarians who are gonna change the world, and we need to breed to like, and so you need to find a girlfriend who will, it's just
Yeah.
very, very toxic.